I will find a way. I promise you, I am coming home.
The little girl's trembling hands pressed against the cold prison glass as tears streamed down her cheeks. "Daddy, please come home," she whispered, her tiny voice barely rising above the silence that filled the visitation room. On the other side stood a weary man in a faded prison uniform, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion, but his eyes still carrying the warmth of a loving father. He slowly lifted his hand to meet hers through the barrier they could never cross. "I need you to be brave," he said softly. "No matter what anyone tells you, never stop believing me. I didn't do this." She shook her head, unable to understand why the kindest man she knew had become someone the world called a criminal. Every second apart felt like another piece of her childhood slipping away. "When will you come home?" she asked, her voice breaking. He forced a gentle smile despite the pain threatening to crush him. "Wait for me. One day, the truth will find its way into the light, and when it does, I'll walk through our front door again." The guard announced that visiting hours were over. As the little girl was led away, she kept looking back until the heavy steel door closed between them forever. 10 years passed. The promise became little more than a fading memory buried beneath the forgotten court files, abandoned evidence rooms, and lives that had moved on. Then, on a rainy October morning, a small, unmarked package arrived at the office of defense attorney Rebecca Lawson. There was no return address. Inside rested an old digital audio recorder, scratched with age and wrapped beside a single handwritten note. It read, "Someone deserves to hear this before it's too late." Rebecca frowned, turning the dusty recorder over in her hands. The battery was dead, but a tiny indicator light flickered for the briefest moment before disappearing again. She had no idea that the forgotten device might hold the power to erase 10 stolen years, or reveal the secret that powerful people had been willing to protect at any cost. 10 years earlier, before prison walls replaced open skies, Daniel Carter's world had been wonderfully ordinary. Every morning before sunrise, he unlocked the faded blue doors of Carter Auto Repair, a modest garage tucked beside the old highway. The scent of engine oil mixed with fresh coffee as loyal customers greeted him by name. They trusted him because he never charged for repairs people didn't need. And in a town where honesty had become rare, that made him different. His greatest pride wasn't the little shop that barely paid the bills. It was 7-year-old Emma. Since his wife, Grace, had lost her battle with cancer 3 years before, Daniel had become both mother and father. He packed school lunches, braided uneven ponytails after watching countless tutorials, read bedtime stories with funny character voices, and never let Emma see how often he skipped meals so she could have everything she needed. People admired him, though few realized how lonely his nights truly were. Across town, another man lived in a world Daniel could barely imagine. Victor Ashcroft owned towering office buildings, luxury estates, and nearly every major business in the county. Expensive suits replaced oil-stained coveralls, private security replaced friendly neighbors, and influence opened doors money alone never could. To most people, Victor was the town's greatest success story. Yet behind polished smiles and charitable speeches, he carried a fear that refused to disappear. Several weeks earlier, he'd noticed something unsettling. On an evening he desperately wished had gone unseen, a familiar pickup truck had briefly passed near an abandoned warehouse outside town. It belonged to Daniel Carter. Victor couldn't be certain the mechanic had witnessed anything important. Perhaps Daniel had simply taken a wrong turn. Perhaps he had seen nothing at all. But perhaps was a dangerous word for men with secrets worth millions. Soon afterward, Daniel began noticing things that felt too small to matter. A black sedan parked across from his garage longer than necessary. Unknown callers hung up the moment he answered. Once, while locking the shop after sunset, he caught the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching from the shadows. He looked around. The street appeared completely empty, but someone was already deciding that an ordinary mechanic had become an extraordinary problem. The evening began like countless others. Daniel closed the garage just after sunset, picked up Emma from a neighbor's house, and promised her pancakes for dinner. Halfway home, he realized he had left his favorite wrench at the shop. Smiling, he told Emma they'd make one quick stop before heading home. That simple decision changed everything. As Daniel pulled behind the garage, he noticed headlights weaving toward the abandoned warehouse across the road. Curiosity tugged at him. The building had been empty for years, yet 3 expensive black SUVs rolled silently inside. Moments later, Ray's voices shattered the quiet night. Daniel instinctively stepped closer, keeping Emma safely inside the truck. Through a cracked loading door, he caught sight of Victor Ashcroft arguing with another man clutching a thick briefcase. Bundles of cash spilled onto the concrete floor. The argument escalated. Accusations about missing company funds echoed through the warehouse, and then a deafening gunshot froze the air. The man collapsed instantly. Daniel staggered backward, his heart pounding. Before he could react, another voice shouted, "Someone's outside!" He grabbed his wrench, rushed to his truck, and drove away without looking back, desperate only to protect Emma. Within hours, flashing police lights illuminated his small house. Officers searched every room before discovering blood-stained gloves hidden beneath his workbench and a pistol buried behind the garage. Daniel stared in disbelief. He had never seen either item before. "I've been framed," he insisted as handcuffs tightened around his wrists. Neighbors watched silently from their porches. Customers who once praised his honesty avoided his eyes. Friends stopped answering their phones. Emma clung to his leg, crying uncontrollably. "My daddy didn't do anything." No one listened. Months later, inside a crowded courtroom, every witness seemed to tell a different version of the truth. A security guard suddenly claimed he had seen Daniel fleeing the warehouse. A financial manager insisted Daniel had threatened the victim days earlier. Even evidence that once appeared uncertain was presented as undeniable fact. Daniel pleaded with the jury until his voice cracked. "I swear before God, I'm innocent." The judge lowered his eyes before delivering the words that shattered 2 lives forever. "Guilty." The gavel struck once, echoing through the courtroom like the sound of hope breaking beyond repair. Prison did not steal Daniel's freedom all at once. It took it piece by piece. The clang of steel doors replaced the sound of Emma's laughter. Cold concrete replaced the warmth of home. Every sunrise looked exactly like the one before it, as though time itself had decided to stop moving. Yet even in a place built to crush hope, Daniel refused to let anger become the only thing his daughter would remember about him. Every week, he wrote her a letter. He filled the pages with encouragement instead of despair, telling her to study hard, be kind, and never let the world's opinion define her future. He never described the violence inside the prison or the lonely nights when he questioned whether anyone still believed him. Each letter ended the same way. "I love you. I'm still coming home." Emma's life outside was changing just as painfully. After months in foster care, she was welcomed into the home of Margaret Ellis, a retired school librarian whose gentle heart reminded Emma of the mother she barely remembered. Margaret gave her safety, patience, and unconditional love, but she could never erase the whispers that followed her through school hallways. "That's the murderer's daughter." Those words hurt more than she ever admitted. Still, every letter from Daniel became a lifeline. She read each one until the paper softened at the folds, believing that if her father could keep hoping behind prison walls, she could keep believing beyond them. Then something strange began to happen. The letters arrived less often. Weeks became months. Birthdays passed without a single envelope. Daniel assumed Emma had stopped writing. Emma feared her father had finally given up. Neither knew the truth. Hidden inside the prison mailroom, someone was quietly removing selected letters before they ever reached their destination. The missing pages carried more than love. They contained names, memories, and small details Daniel had begun remembering about the night of the murder. Someone wasn't merely separating a father from his daughter. Someone was making certain they could never compare the pieces of a truth that was slowly returning. While Daniel counted the passing years in a prison cell, the people responsible for stealing his life flourished in the sunlight. Victor Ashcroft's empire grew larger than ever. His smiling face appeared on charity billboards. Business magazines praised his generosity, and local politicians eagerly accepted his donations. To the town, he was a respected leader. Only a handful of people knew that his fortune rested on a lie that had cost an innocent man a decade. He was not alone. Detective Richard Collins, the lead investigator on Daniel's case, had retired early with a generous consulting contract from one of Ashcroft's companies. Assistant District Attorney Leonard Briggs had earned promotions, public recognition, and a reputation for winning impossible cases. Their rewards had come with one unspoken condition. Daniel Carter could never be allowed to walk free. Every few months, the three men met privately under the excuse of discussing business investments. Yet their conversations always drifted toward the same uneasy question. Has anything new surfaced? The answer was always reassuring. No witnesses, no missing files, no surviving evidence. Still, Victor never looked completely relieved. Secrets had a way of surviving in unexpected places, and he knew better than anyone that the smallest forgotten detail could destroy everything they had built. Across town, another man was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Retired Detective Samuel Hayes had spent 40 years investigating murders before leaving the force. While organizing old case files for a criminal justice lecture, he reopened Daniel Carter's folder purely by chance. The deeper he looked, the less sense the case made. Witness statements had changed dramatically between initial interviews and the trial. Photographs appeared to be missing from the evidence log. Laboratory reports had been signed days before some evidence was officially collected. Even the timeline seemed impossible. Samuel frowned as he spread the documents across his dining room table. Either this had been the sloppiest investigation of his career, or someone had carefully rewritten history. As rain tapped against his window, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "If I'm right," he whispered, "someone is still protecting the truth." And somewhere, someone else was already watching him. By the time Emma turned 27, she had stopped introducing herself with hesitation. People still remembered the headlines from years ago, but she refused to let them define either her or her father. Every spare hour outside her job was devoted to one mission: proving that Daniel Carter had never belonged behind prison walls. The legal system, however, seemed determined to keep the past buried. Appeal after appeal was denied. Judges claimed there was no new evidence. Records disappeared from courthouse archives. Witnesses who had once hinted at doubts suddenly refused to speak. Some insisted they remembered nothing at all, while others ended conversations the moment Daniel's name was mentioned. Instead of breaking her spirit, every closed door only deepened her resolve. With Detective Samuel Hayes quietly guiding her, Emma spent weekends searching through dusty public records, forgotten newspaper archives, and storage rooms filled with neglected case files. They uncovered missing photographs that had never reached the courtroom, conflicting police reports, and financial records suggesting that millions of dollars had vanished from Victor Ashcroft's company just days before the murder. The pieces refused to fit together. Every answer created two new questions. Who had erased so much evidence? And what were they still afraid of? Months passed with nothing but frustration. Then, on an unusually quiet Tuesday afternoon, Emma received a phone call from a woman whose voice trembled with age. "My name is Eleanor Brooks," she said softly. "I believe my late husband kept something that belongs to your father." Emma's heart skipped. Eleanor explained that her husband had worked as a delivery driver years earlier. After his recent passing, She had begun sorting through boxes stored in the attic. One small container had been labeled simply, "Warehouse Night." "I never understood what it meant," Eleanor admitted, "but after seeing your father's story on television last week, I think you should have it." The following morning, Emma stood in Eleanor's modest living room as the elderly woman gently placed a weathered storage box into her hands. Inside, beneath faded receipts and old photographs, rested an object neither of them expected to find. Everything was about to change. Emma carefully lifted the object from the storage box, brushing away years of dust with trembling fingers. It was a small digital voice recorder, its plastic casing cracked and badly scratched, as though it had survived more than one careless fall. A faded strip of tape covered the back. In shaky handwriting were four simple words: "Delivery route, Friday night." Detective Samuel Hayes stared at it in silence before whispering, "That was the night Daniel was arrested." Eleanor nodded sadly. Her late husband, Thomas, had driven deliveries throughout the county and often carried the recorder to dictate addresses and customer notes while on the road. He had never mentioned anything unusual about that evening, but after his death, the recorder had remained forgotten in the attic, untouched for an entire decade. Emma's pulse quickened. If Thomas had accidentally recorded anything near the warehouse, it could be the first untouched evidence anyone had found in 10 years. There was only one problem. The recorder refused to turn on. Its battery had corroded long ago, and the memory chip appeared badly damaged. Two digital forensic specialists examined the device under bright laboratory lights. After several tense minutes, neither looked optimistic. "The files might still exist," one expert admitted carefully, "but recovering them won't be easy. We could lose everything with a single mistake." Emma swallowed hard. 10 years of waiting suddenly rested on a piece of aging technology that might never speak again. Word of the discovery traveled faster than anyone expected. Somewhere inside Victor Ashcroft's towering office, a frightened phone call shattered the evening's calm. "They found something," the caller whispered. Victor's expression hardened. "What kind of something?" "A recorder." For the first time in years, genuine fear crossed his face. He immediately contacted Richard Collins and Leonard Briggs. Their instructions were swift, desperate, and unmistakable. "Find that recorder before anyone hears what's on it." As forensic experts worked through the night to rescue corrupted files, invisible eyes followed every move Emma made. The countdown had begun. If the recorder revealed its secret first, an innocent man could finally be free. If it disappeared first, the truth might remain buried forever. The forensic laboratory became the center of a battle no one outside its walls could see. Hour after hour, technicians worked beneath bright lights, carefully dismantling the damaged recorder one microscopic piece at a time. Every recovered byte of data felt like rescuing a heartbeat from the past. Emma waited outside the examination room, unable to sit still, while Samuel Hayes watched every entrance with the instincts of a detective who knew danger was drawing closer. It arrived sooner than expected. One morning, the laboratory doors were found pried open. Cabinets had been searched, computers damaged, and security cameras disabled. Strangely, nothing valuable had been stolen, except the intruders had searched only one room, the room where the recorder had been stored. Fortunately, Samuel had insisted it be moved to a secure evidence vault the previous evening. Anonymous phone calls followed. "Stop digging," a cold voice warned Emma. "Some graves should stay closed." Then came the legal attacks. Victor Ashcroft's attorneys filed emergency motions claiming the recorder had no verified chain of custody and should be declared inadmissible before anyone could hear its contents. Every delay felt intentional, buying time for people desperate to protect their secrets. Worse still, witnesses who had recently agreed to speak suddenly vanished. One left town overnight. Another refused to answer calls after reporting that someone had been following his family. Meanwhile, tiny fragments of audio slowly emerged from the corrupted memory. Static filled most recordings, but between the crackling noise came scattered voices. Money missing. Nobody can know. He saw each incomplete sentence raised more questions than answers. Emma replayed the fragments repeatedly, convinced they belonged to the night that destroyed her father's life. The experts believed a complete recovery was possible, but only if the damaged memory chips survived the final extraction process. One mistake could erase everything forever. As another sleepless night settled over the laboratory, Samuel locked the vault himself and slipped his revolver into his coat pocket. He no longer doubted the truth. Someone powerful was terrified of a voice recorded 10 years earlier, and that fear meant they were closer than ever to exposing it. The laboratory fell completely silent as the lead forensic analyst inserted a restored copy of the recovered files into a secure computer. Emma stood beside Samuel Hayes, hardly daring to breathe. Rebecca Lawson folded her arms tightly, while two court-appointed observers watched every movement to ensure the evidence remained beyond question. The analyst pressed play. At first, there was only the familiar crackle of static and the distant hum of an engine. Then a clear timestamp appeared on the screen, matching the official timeline from the night of the murder down to the exact minute. A man's anxious voice broke the silence. "I brought every dollar. That's all the company money." Emma's heart pounded. Another voice answered, calm and unmistakable. "Victor Ashcroft. It stopped being company money the moment I decided where it belonged." The room froze. The argument grew louder as the frightened employee demanded protection, insisting he wanted no part in the fraud any longer. Victor's tone sharpened into cold fury. "You signed every transfer. If this comes out, you fall with me." "I'll tell the police everything," the employee shouted. Several footsteps echoed across the recording. Another voice entered. "Richard Collins. He's outside," he warned. "A pickup just drove past." Victor hesitated for only a moment. "Then nobody leaves here alive." A deafening gunshot exploded through the speakers. Emma instinctively covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Seconds later, hurried breathing replaced the silence. "What about the mechanic?" Collins asked. "He may have seen something." Victor answered without emotion. "Make sure he becomes the killer." The recording continued. Leonard Briggs calmly discussed arranging witness statements before the investigation even began. Collins described planting the weapon in blood-stained gloves. Victor instructed them to intercept Daniel's letters if he ever started remembering details from that night. "No loose ends," he ordered. 10 years, 20 years, it doesn't matter. He stays buried. When the recording ended, no one spoke. Every missing piece suddenly fit together. The altered witness testimonies, the disappearing evidence, the intercepted letters, the impossible investigation. Even the timestamps embedded within the digital file matched police dispatch logs, surveillance footage, and emergency call records. Independent experts confirmed they had not been altered. Fabricating such precise data after a decade would have been virtually impossible. Rebecca slowly looked at Emma. "We don't just have reasonable doubt," she whispered. "We have the truth." For 10 years, Daniel Carter had carried the weight of another man's crime. Now, with a single forgotten recording, the entire conspiracy had finally found its voice. And the men who believed they had buried the truth forever had just confessed to the world. The recording spread through official channels with astonishing speed. Within 48 hours, the state attorney general ordered an emergency review of Daniel Carter's conviction. News stations interrupted regular programming to report that one of the county's most celebrated murder cases might have been built on corruption from the very beginning. The public was stunned. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Daniel's daughter now questioned everything they had believed. Reporters crowded courthouse steps, demanding answers that officials could no longer avoid. Then the silence began to crack. The security guard who had testified against Daniel confessed that Detective Richard Collins had threatened to charge his son with drug crimes unless he changed his statement. Another witness admitted she had accepted money from an intermediary connected to Victor Ashcroft. One by one, frightened voices finally chose truth over fear. Arrest warrants followed. Collins was taken into custody outside his lakeside home without resistance. Leonard Briggs was escorted from his office in handcuffs as stunned co-workers watched in disbelief. Victor Ashcroft attempted to escape aboard his private jet before dawn, but federal agents surrounded the aircraft moments before takeoff. For the first time in a decade, the powerful men had nowhere left to hide. Inside the prison, Daniel was called unexpectedly to the warden's office. Every step down the familiar corridor felt unreal. He had walked those halls thousands of times, always expecting disappointment. This time, the warden stood waiting with an expression Daniel had never seen before. "You've been exonerated," he said quietly. "You're going home." Daniel closed his eyes, unable to speak. Minutes later, the massive steel gates slowly rolled open. Beyond them stood Emma. No glass separated them now. No guards watched the clock. No walls stood between father and daughter. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then Emma ran. Daniel caught her in his arms, holding her with the desperate strength of a father reclaiming 10 stolen years. Both of them wept openly, surrounded by flashing cameras that disappeared into the background. "I told you I'd come home," he whispered through tears. Emma smiled, her voice trembling with relief. "I never stopped waiting." For the first time in 10 years, Daniel Carter stepped forward not as prisoner 48217, but as an innocent man whose name had finally been restored. Freedom felt unfamiliar to Daniel. The world had moved forward while his life had remained frozen behind concrete walls. Smartphones, self-checkout stores, and faces that had grown older reminded him daily that 10 years could never be returned. The hardest moments were the ordinary ones. Sitting across from Emma at breakfast, he caught himself wondering how many birthdays, school plays, graduations, and quiet evenings he had missed because someone else's lies had stolen them forever. More than once, guilt overwhelmed him. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he whispered one evening. Emma reached across the table and took his hand. "You were always there," she said gently, "not in person, but in every letter, every promise, and every reason I kept fighting." Her words eased a burden Daniel had carried since the prison gates first closed. Healing came slowly. They visited Grace's grave together, sharing memories through tears and laughter. They reopened the old garage, leaving its weathered sign untouched as a reminder that honest work had never been the problem. Customers returned, not out of sympathy, but out of respect for a man whose integrity had survived everything designed to destroy it. The town also faced its own reckoning. Neighbors who had once believed the headlines apologized with lowered eyes. Local newspapers printed public corrections. Schools used Daniel's story to teach students the danger of judging people before knowing the truth. Even those who never spoke to him again quietly carried the weight of their assumptions. Daniel chose forgiveness over bitterness. He knew anger could consume another 10 years if he allowed it. One evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, father and daughter stood outside the garage watching the lights flicker on. They could never reclaim the years they had lost. But together, they finally understood something even more powerful. Love had waited where time could not. The settlement Daniel received could never repay 10 stolen years, but he refused to let it become nothing more than compensation for his pain. Instead, he transformed it into hope for families still living the nightmare he had survived. Together with Emma and Rebecca Lawson, he established the Carter Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted parents fight for justice while providing financial and emotional support to children forced to grow up without innocent mothers or fathers. Families from across the country began reaching out. Some needed legal representation. Others simply needed someone who truly understood their heartbreak. Daniel welcomed every one of them with the compassion he had longed for during his own darkest days. The old digital recorder, once forgotten inside a dusty storage box, found a permanent home in the state's Justice History Museum. Restored but never altered, it stood behind protective glass as a reminder that even the quietest voice could outlive the loudest lie. Thousands came to see it not because it was valuable, but because it proved that truth can survive years of silence. On the anniversary of his release, Daniel and Emma returned to the same prison where they had once been separated by a sheet of cold glass. This time they stood together outside the gates beneath a bright morning sky. Emma smiled and looked at her father. "You kept your promise." Daniel squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with gratitude instead of sorrow. "I told you I'd come home." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Some promises are stronger than prison walls. Some truths take years to be heard. But when even one honest voice refuses to surrender, darkness eventually gives way to light. And for one father and one daughter, love had done what time, fear, and lies never could. It had brought them home.